Today we're going to be talking about meaningful digital transformation and two aspects really of this. How we bring sustainability into our digital work, but also how we bring wellness and sustainability into our work as people who work in digital. And just to quickly give you a rundown, so I'll give you a short introduction, then I'm going to look at digital transformation and the environment, just a very quick introduction as to how these two topics fit together and why it's important that they do fit together. I'm going to then spend a bit of time talking about digital sustainability and its solutions, and then I'm going to talk about well-being and sustainability at work, and then we'll have some time at the end for questions, which I'm looking forward to. So yeah, as Chiara said, just a little bit about myself. I'm the founder of a digital agency in the UK that specializes in working particularly with nonprofits, public sector, and purpose-led organizations like B Corps, trying to help them further their mission, use digital design and technology to do that, but also for us to try and run our business in a way that is respectful to humans, good for society, good for the environment, and looking at how we sort of adapt our business operations and the work we do in digital to align with our own ethos. And as Chiara said, author of the book, Sustainable Web Design, which you should be able to get over there in Canada as well. I'm also the creator of website carbon.com, which is as it sounds like, it's a carbon calculator that gives you an estimate of the carbon emissions and energy consumption of a web page. So it's a free tool you can use online. And we recently released a rating system. So this is now sort of growing to become more of a collaborative open source project with people in the US and Europe working together to evolve this and the methodology behind it to embed into other tools. So I'm just going to give you a quick introduction to why all of this is relevant to digital transformation. Digital transformation, as most of you will know, it means many things to many people, but digital technology has been around for a long time. I mean, it's really been around since at least the 1940s. But in recent times, we've really crossed the tipping point from it being a thing that's on the fringes in the IT department that is used for a few kind of specific purposes within an organization. We've crossed that tipping point in the last, the beginning of the 21st century, where now it's fundamental to every aspect of an organization. And so now, instead of it being the sort of the IT department of the 80s and 90s, it's very much something that all of us need to look at, even if we're not IT people or techie people. And so this is something that we all know now that we need to be embracing. And I think it's important in that context to remember just how much this has changed in a very short period of time. So, the 80s and the 90s IT department might feel like a long time ago, but the iPhone was only launched in 2007. So that's really not that long ago. And now we can't imagine the world without smartphones. Most of us wouldn't really know how to function day to day without smartphones. So the pace of change has been really fast. And now obviously, we've hit this tipping point with AI coming into the mainstream and affecting things that people can do day to day. There's going to be another acceleration of digital into every aspect of what we do. And so we all need to be prepared for that and to be thinking about how we can actually utilize this so in a way that's actually responsible and healthy for our organizations, for our people, and for the environment. And in that context, we tend to think of this digital technology as virtual. We use words like the cloud or virtual to imply although the digital sector tends to be thought of and tends to talk about itself as if it's the most forward-thinking sector and it's very futuristic, always ahead of the curve. Actually, when it comes to environmental issues, the digital sector has really been lagging behind most other kind of more traditional sectors, and there's been very little discussion of environmental issues until fairly recently within the digital sector. I'm going to skip this, sorry. So digital transformation can mean like many things. It can mean modernizing your IT. It can mean digitizing your operations and trying to optimize your internal processes for improved efficiency and quality. It can be about harnessing digital for your marketing and delivering new services online rather than in the kind of traditional methods. And it can also be about exploring new opportunities for your organization to do things, new business models and products and services that you may never have been able to do without digital technology. So there's many pillars of digital transformation that are going to be relevant to all of us, and increasingly so as time goes forward. And all of these things very much fit into this, virtual world that is impacting our real lives day to day. And then we have the ecological crisis. So we have the convergence of this wave of digital transformation hitting the ecological crisis, which is now very much upon us. And I'm not going to leave this slide up there for very long, but there's been terrible crisis already, in all aspects of the world. North America particularly badly hit with wildfires and hurricanes. But this is something that we need to prepare for, both in terms of mitigating it as far as we can, but also building resilience in what we're doing so that we can adapt to these challenges. But there's also lots of good stuff happening. There is hope on the horizon. It may not seem like it sometimes with sort of the state of politics and so on, but there are people out there who are doing really good things to actually try and build more resilient ecosystems and try to adapt our economy and our society and our culture to operate in more sustainable ways. And I hope that that's what we can do in the digital sector as well, by actually trying to think about these things more holistically in terms of what these things actually mean to humans, as well as how they impact the environment and the symbiotic relationship that we have there. In Canada, you've got some net zero targets. Your government has set a net zero target for 2050 with the aim of reducing emissions by 40% by 2030, and 2/3 of Canada's largest companies have set net zero targets. So this is where we really see, these dates are creeping up on us quickly. Like 2030 is now only 6 years away, and I think this is part of the reason why we're now seeing a bigger focus on environmental issues within organizations. And I think this is partly why it's now starting to actually creep into the digital sector, because people are setting these net zero targets and they're saying, okay, but what are the digital teams doing about this? And until recently, the digital teams were mostly saying, well, everything we do is a solution. Like, everything we do is great and it just makes the world better. And there's lots of benefits to digital technology, but now people are actually asking deeper questions. We tend to think, the aviation industry gets a lot of media attention for its carbon footprint. Most people have an awareness that flying has a very high carbon footprint, but it's actually equal to or less than the carbon footprint of the internet. And yet the internet gets almost no attention for its carbon footprint whatsoever. So this is not to downplay the impact of aviation, but it's to highlight that the internet is actually one of the biggest sectors when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. And this is something that needs to be addressed. A simple formula to keep in your mind is basically that the data, whether you're processing it, storing it, transmitting it over a network, doing anything with data requires electricity, and producing electricity produces CO2. When you keep that in mind, then suddenly you can sort of make a connection between these things and see that we need to use data more efficiently. So talking of efficiency, and I mentioned the website Carbon Calculator earlier, Berkshire Hathaway, so this is Warren Buffett's company, they have one of the lowest carbon websites out there. So about 0.05 grams of CO2 per page view. It gets an A+ rating on websitecarbon.com. And this is a website that would not meet most people's modern user experience requirements, and it hasn't changed for a very, very long time. But it highlights the fact that old websites actually were quite efficient. A more modern website Pepsi Canada is actually very high carbon, gets an F rating on website carbon, 0.86 grams of CO2. So it's, you know, about 100 and it's many times. It's about 16 times more polluting than the Berkshire Hathaway website. But it doesn't need to be. It's easy to think, well, this is a more modern website. Of course, it's more polluting. But actually, you could produce this website and it could be very, very efficient. To give you another example, one of the biggest charities over there in Canada, World Vision Canada, also similar in emissions to the Pepsi website. And this is slightly better, but there's huge opportunities to actually make these things more efficient and actually improve user experience rather than have any compromises. So how do we solve this? Well, I'm going to give you just a few simple things that you can do in your web projects. We're not going to get too technical today. Just to highlight, you know, low-hanging fruit, things you can do that actually make a real difference. The first is to question everything. So just thinking about that equation that, you know, data uses electricity and electricity produces CO2. Basically, think about, like, do we need these services? And any services that you're designing or operating, like, challenge every design feature, challenge every piece of functionality. If you are a designer or a developer, you know, like, look really closely to what you're doing and take a really minimalist mindset to what you're doing. Like, how can you strip it back and make it simpler and easier? That will make it more efficient, and generally that will make it better for the environment as well. Would anyone miss these things if they're gone? I think that's always a good question to ask. And when you're looking at stripping something out, you might be attached to it. Maybe it's always been there, but actually, if you took it out, would anybody notice? There's a lot of design features on many websites that if you remove them, probably nobody would notice. And can we achieve the same with less? You know, that's a good kind of engineering principle of how can we actually get the same outcome, the same result, the same benefit for your organization and the same benefit for the end user, but in a much more streamlined way. So really embracing the, you know, the true spirit of user experience design there. Some examples of you know, questioning everything and making it minimalist. Volkswagen Canada, I just use this example because it's in Canada. We did this project with them. Did a low carbon browsing experience for the ID4 electric car, where they actually had two versions. They had their standard version, and then they had low carbon version where they replaced all of the images with ASCII text images. So they literally regenerated the images out of text, which is super low data, very, very tiny file sizes. And they did this partly as an educational experience for their own teams, but also partly to educate their customers as well about the environmental impact of digital services. Another example is autoplay videos. So this is a classic one. Very popular these days to have an auto-playing video on your homepage of your website. So you land on the page and there's this video in the background that starts playing immediately. And these consume huge amounts of data, very energy intensive, and they also slow websites down. And Brian Chen wrote an article for the New York Times specifically about autoplay videos because they're so pervasive nowadays. And he said autoplay videos demand your attention while burning through your data plan and sucking up your batteries. And I think, you know, it's another example of, like, questioning, do you really need it? And what are the impacts? You know, would your users actually be better off if you took it away? You're going to save them data. You're going to save them battery life. Your website's going to load faster. And then analytics as well is another place where you can really question, do we really need this? Could we manage with less? There's so many tracking scripts and advertising scripts that are built into websites these days that really slow the websites down, and they're invading people's privacy. They're consuming energy, and actually they're making the user experience worse, particularly if you're operating in regions where you need to have these cookie banners like the European Union. It really ruins the user experience and has a detrimental effect both for the end user and for the organization. And there are many ways that you can strip back analytics and tracking so that it's super efficient. It respects privacy. You can get rid of these cookie banners and everybody's a winner, including the environment. Another thing that you can do is use darker colors. So on modern screens, light colors use more energy than dark colors on the end user's device. So thinking about how you can adapt your brand to actually use darker colors in your digital services is a really good thing to think about. Some people do this by simply just having one digital brand palette that is dark or a sort of a mid-tone, rather than defaulting to always having pure white backgrounds, which is sort of always been the common thing on the web. Other people do it by having two versions of the website that can adapt to people's device settings, so a light version and a dark version, because that also respects their accessibility requirements as well, which is really important. But it's a good thing to think about, could we use darker colors, and could that improve user experience, and could that also reduce energy consumption? Just an example of that, Greenhouse Sports is a sports charity over here in London, and in the latest version of their website, they updated their online brand to use darker colors from their brand palette, which actually tied in really nicely with what they're trying to do with getting youths engaged in sports here in London. It's very bold, it's striking, it appeals to their target demographic, but it's also better for the environment. So it's a nice way of sort of thinking creatively about how you can adapt an existing brand in a way that's better for the end users, but also better for the environment. And then the third sort of low-hanging fruit, really, in terms of reducing the environmental impact of your web services is using green hosting, trying to find a hosting provider that has some commitment to energy efficiency and using renewable energy to power its data centers. There's a lot of sort of technical aspects to this, which we don't need to get into today, in terms of how green are they, from sort of light green to very dark green, very robust commitments. But the best place to start looking, I always suggest, is the Green Web Foundation, which has the biggest database globally of data center providers that have registered this, a commitment to using renewable energy in their data centers. So they've got a directory there. You can also test websites to see whether they're hosted in a data center that has a commitment to using renewable energy. So that's an easy win without changing anything in design or development if you can switch to a green host. I think it's important to mention procurement as well, because if you're working in a nonprofit or a charity, you may well be working with partners, digital agencies, freelancers, as well as software companies, where you're procuring technology. And so putting an environmental aspect into your briefs alongside your other requirements can really help move the needle. So, specify that you want your digital services to be low energy and low carbon. Specify that you want your digital services to be hosted in data centers using renewable energy, and ask your suppliers to see their environmental policies. You might not always get perfect answers, but just having the conversation means that you're more likely to actually get people's minds focused on trying to actually reduce the environmental impact of these digital services. And you can actually encourage your suppliers to look into this and to improve their own environmental standards, which can be really, really powerful. And it's better for people as well. So I've mentioned a few times about some of the benefits that this focus can have for the end users. But I think it's important to talk about data poverty and the fact that when we're wasting data, we're also penalizing the poorest people in society, whether they're disadvantaged people in a Western country like Canada or the UK, or whether they're people who are living in developing countries where data is far more expensive relative to their local incomes. Jerry McGovern, author of Worldwide Waste, says large web pages are taxes on the poor. And I think that's a really good kind of thing to hold in your mind when you're designing your digital services, is if we make them really efficient, we're making them more inclusive and we're making them more accessible. If we don't think about that, then actually we're unfairly discriminating against the poorest people in society. There's also an issue of speed, that the poorest people in society tend to have the slowest connections. So, and this is both true like geographically as well as in terms of what data plan they have in their home country. So just as an example, Liechtenstein, which is a tiny, tiny country in Europe, just on the border of Switzerland, um, is one of the wealthiest countries in the world, and their internet is 394 times faster than the internet in South Sudan. So, and there's, every year there's published a internet speed global league table. If you're designing for, people in the city, people in Toronto or people in London, and you're testing your digital services yourself, sitting in your office with your fiber optic broadband connection on your latest laptop or your latest iPhone or Samsung device, you're not testing for those people who are operating on slower connections, slower devices. Maybe they live out in the countryside. Maybe they just have a slow data plan. Maybe they have an old, cheap device. You need to be testing for the worst case scenario, not the best case scenario. And just an example of that, the average device globally, smartphone, is something like this, Motorola Moto E6. Looks kind of okay, but it's actually painfully slow. And that's an average device, which means that 50% of the world's internet users have a device worse than this. So it's always good to be testing on something that is like a really old, slow device to try and figure out, like, okay, if I'm in like imperfect conditions, what is the experience of using our website, using our apps, whatever it is, and is it actually an acceptable experience? And this is a great quote from Alex Russell, who works for Microsoft and is a real expert on this topic. He says, when we construct a digital world to the limits of the best devices, we build a less usable one to 80% of the world's users. So I think this just really hits the nail on the head, that actually, those of us who work have the privilege of working in the digital sector, and we live in Western countries, we are in the top few percent of the world's most privileged people when it comes to access to digital services. And actually, if we shift our perspective, we can make things that are better for everybody. And a focus on environmental sustainability gives us a focus on efficiency, and that in turn benefits users and improves accessibility and inclusivity as a result. So just to kind of wrap up this part, there's many reasons why people should care, even if they're not specifically focused on the environmental aspect. When we put a focus on the environmental aspect, we do end up with better web performance. We do end up with better accessibility and inclusivity. We can reduce hosting costs by actually requiring less server capacity. We can make maintenance easier by having more efficient, organized code. We can improve user experience through a variety of means I've mentioned. We can improve SEO and conversion rates through improved user experience and improved web performance and better quality code. And then we have the benefits of the environment as well. So all of these things are actually synergistic, like they all help each other. And what we found is that actually, now that there's so many people working in the digital sector who are genuinely concerned about the ecological crisis, the climate crisis, and asking, what can I do in my role? What can I do in my job that's gonna help solve this? Bringing this into the conversation in digital projects means that you can get them really inspired and motivated, have a benefit for the environment, as well as actually benefiting all of the other aspects that you would want to achieve in terms of performance outcomes for your organization, whether it's a website or another digital service. So let's talk about things we can do in the workplace. So I like this quote from David Spinks, social scientist. Companies are communities. And I think the word company has always summed this up. And I know that many of you are from nonprofit organizations or charities, but ultimately the principle is the same, that organizations are groups of people getting together to try to do things and make a difference in the world. And I think it's easy to lose sight of that human aspect in whatever we're doing. If I run a digital agency, it's easy to get very focused on digital technology and websites and web performance and all of these kind of technical things. But ultimately, when it comes down to it, it's about humans. It's about the humans that are creating it. It's about the humans that we're serving. And I think as we think about sustainability in the digital context, it's true that we can make things more efficient and we can reduce the energy consumption and carbon emissions and electronic waste by doing those direct things within our web projects to make them better. But we can also do things in terms of how we run our organizations that are going to be good for the environment, as well as improve well-being for the human beings that work within our organizations. So I'm going to run through some things that we've done here at Wholegrain that try to bring these two things together, try to bring together our focus on sustainability with our focus on trying to actually look after our team as human beings. So the first one is home energy. We live in a world now where a lot of people are spending a lot of time working from home. And so a lot of the energy that's actually being used in our day-to-day work to power our computers and our lighting and our heating and so on isn't in the office, it's in people's houses. And so we, as an organization, we want to try and use 100% renewable energy, if it's possible, to power our business. And this poses a problem. If people are working at home, we don't have any control over their home energy. How do we solve that? So we tried various things over the years to try and get people to switch their home energy to a renewable energy supply. And the thing that we found worked was offering them some extra holiday. So we tried offering them money, that didn't work somehow. But offering people extra time off, an extra day a year, really like moved the needle. And it took a few years, but once we introduced this, we went from 2 people in our entire company of sustainability focused people having a renewable energy supply to 100%. So it took a little while, but it really worked. So it does fluctuate a bit, like new people join the team. Obviously that 100% figure might get knocked down, but then we bring them on board and we talk them through why this is important. And now we've got a critical mass of people in the team who have made this switch. There's people who can actually tell them about the experience of how easy it was. I don't know what it's like in Canada, but here in the UK, there's a perception that changing energy provider at home is really, really difficult, and it's going to be really stressful and time consuming and possibly expensive to have a renewable energy supply. But the truth is actually very, very different. It's very, very quick and easy to change energy supplier. It's actually regulated that the energy suppliers have to make it so in the UK. And there's really very little difference in terms of cost for renewable energy supply. So this is something that has really made a difference in terms of our organization's carbon footprint, is shifting all of this day-to-day home working energy over to renewables. So I'm really proud of that. Another thing we've done is called the green handshake. So I'm always cautious to highlight that this is not carbon offsetting, but it's about trying to help people understand the connection between their own impact and what that means in terms of like nature's systems and resilience. So it takes around 1,260 trees to absorb in any given year the amount of CO2 emitted in that year by an average UK citizen. So what we do when somebody joins Wholegrain is we fund the planting of 1,260 trees to help them understand this relationship, and symbolically also to mean that for the next 25, 30 years of that tree's growth, every year there will be those trees out there that will be absorbing CO2 sort of on their behalf. Now, obviously, it doesn't literally tie up like that. There's naturally not all of those trees will survive their full life. But I think it's been really powerful for our team in helping them understand their own environmental impact and the scale of what it means in terms of nature. You think about, yeah, trees absorb CO2, but how many trees do there need to be for me personally? So putting a number on it when people join the company is something that I think has been quite powerful. Now, we've got a scheme called Climate Perks that we introduced a number of years ago, And this is another nice one in terms of well-being and sustainability. So it's very common in the UK that when people go on their holidays, they go abroad. They, somewhere in Europe or further afield, nearly always with a plane. So most of our team members will go on a plane at least once a year for their own personal travels, if not more than once a year. And so this is a huge contributor to their own personal carbon footprint if they're, flying off to Italy or Spain or wherever it might be. And we want to try and encourage them as individuals. So this is not business travel. This is their personal travel. We want to try and support them as individuals to reduce their own carbon footprint in a way that's also good for them. And what we find is that the main reason people travel by plane for their holidays is because they can get somewhere really quickly. And to not use a plane can feel very limiting and feel very restrictive. So Climate Perks is a scheme where basically we give people some extra time off if they traveled without a plane. So there's obviously limits. There's a limit to like how much we can afford to give as additional time. But there's a lot of places you can go in Europe, and it may be the same. I don't know what it's like in Canada, but there's a lot of places that you can get to on a train relatively quickly, but not as quickly as a plane. So we give people some extra time off. So if they take an extra couple of days, you can travel halfway across Europe in a day. I can get from my home on the south coast of England to Switzerland. I can have breakfast at home. I can get to Switzerland in time for dinner on a train, which is quite incredible. But most people don't know that because they default to just using the plane. So Climate Perks is both trying to solve the problem of overcoming the barrier of time and making people feel like they're not having to compromise their own holidays in order to reduce their environmental impact, but also educating people about the benefits of slow travel and how many places you can get to without an airplane and how enjoyable it is to not have to go through all that chaos and like security checks at the airports and like sit in an uncomfortable seat on an airplane. Some people are scared of flying as well, so you can avoid that. And instead you can sit on a train really comfortable, look out the window, read a book or watch something on your phone, listen to a podcast. So it's an educational thing which has been really effective. On the business side, we also have a no-fly policy for business travel. So it's a blanket rule that we don't fly for business. Most of our clients are in the UK, but we do have clients abroad. If you need to visit them in Europe, we take the train. If we need to visit them in North America, then we use a video call. We've got a veggie food policy. So this is another thing where we're tying in kind of the environmental aspect with people's lives. So we don't force anybody to eat vegetarian in their personal lives, but when we're spending business money on food, so if we're organizing an event or we're going out for a team meal, and we're taking clients out for meals, things like that, we'll always buy like vegetarian or vegan food. This has a lower impact on the environment, but it also means that we're exposing our team to different ways of eating. So nothing's forced upon them, but it opens people's minds. It gives them an experience, not just our team, but also our clients. Hopefully, in general, it's healthy as well. Obviously, vegan or vegetarian food is not always healthy, but generally we try to pick sort of restaurants and caterers and things that actually serve healthy food. So it's where we're introducing people to a healthy lifestyle at the same time. And this is something that's not being forced like from the top down in our organization. Like food choices are like very much like very personal to people, and I think it's important that that's respected. But our team actually had a vote on this a few years ago, and even though most of our team are not vegetarian or vegan, the majority of people in our team are not. They actually voted for this. This is something that they wanted to do. So I thought that was really, really interesting. We have an electric vehicle scheme. So I don't know if this is possible in Canada, but we have a scheme whereby if somebody wants to switch their personal car to an electric vehicle, they can do that through the business. And there's some tax benefits here in the UK for them to do that. Electric cars are very expensive. Not everybody can afford them. And so having some way that the business can make that more affordable for them is a kind of a nice perk that's a win for them, and also good good environmentally as well.
And
we
Tom,
also,
just to give you a sense of time, we have maybe 3 to 4 minutes left before we move to questions. That's okay.
That's perfect.
Great.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, so in a work environment as well, like we try to build this sort of connection between people and the physical nature of digital technology by using refurbished technology. So that's a talking point within our team about the fact that, like, when you join the company, you don't get a brand new shiny laptop fresh out the box. You get one that's been refurbished and been used, but it's just as good as if it was brand new, but it's got a few scratches on it. And this is a huge environmental benefit. There's, huge amounts of CO2 savings in refurbished equipment. The actual production of electronic equipment is one of the biggest sources of CO2 emissions in the digital sector, but also huge reduction in electronic waste. Huge amounts of electronic equipment are thrown away way before they need to be, and we need to encourage more repair and refurbishment of digital technology. So this is something that helps build this connection, and also filters through into people's personal lives as well, because once they realize that this is actually a thing, and that that you can get really good equipment for less money, and with lower environmental impact, and we can help them identify where do you buy this from reliable sources, then they can also do that in their personal lives with any technology they want to buy. We also introduce an activism policy. So a lot of our team, they want to get involved in social activism or environmental activism, but they have concerns around what does this mean in terms of, do I have to take time off? What happens if I'm protesting? Is my employer going to get upset that it might damage the reputation of the company, or I might get in trouble? What if I chain myself to a railing and I get arrested? So we actually developed the first activism policy in the UK. We worked with a law firm here called Bates Wells, who helped us develop it, so that we give additional time off for people who want to take part in sort of some form of activism for a cause that they believe in. And we give them employment protection, so no one's going to get fired for taking part in campaigning for something, social or environmental cause that they believe in. And if they do happen to get arrested, which we hope they don't, and we're certainly not encouraging, but if they do, then we give them also some support in terms of covering some legal costs, to help make sure that it's something that they feel like they can go out and stand up for what they believe in. And as a company, we're striking a balance between not necessarily endorsing any specific actions, but saying we respect the fact that you're doing this, and not everybody's as brave as you to go out there and stand up for what you believe in. So we want to give you some support to do that, and we're grateful for you doing that. And then the last thing I think is really worth mentioning is we have a service called Spill, and there's probably similar things available in Canada, where basically all of our team members get automatically enrolled into a confidential service that they can access through Slack, where they can talk to a professional psychotherapist. They can message them and ask them about things day to day, but they can also arrange Zoom calls where they can have proper psychotherapy sessions to discuss anything in their lives. It doesn't have to be work related, so that we're really supporting the mental well-being of our team and making sure that they can navigate any challenges they're facing in their lives in a way that that's confidential and accessible. They don't have to necessarily discuss things with their line manager that they don't feel comfortable doing. So yeah, so hopefully that's given you all some food for thought, a little bit of inspiration. Hopefully there's been some practical things in there that you can take away. Just before we go to Q&A, I just want to mention as well that together with TechSoup, we recently published a green digital transformation content series. So we've got these 6 articles listed here on the screen. I'm sure the TechSoup team can also kind of share the links to these after the webinar as well, so that you can find them and you can read them in your own time.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Tom. This could easily have been 2 separate webinars, and you gave us lots to think about and lots to get inspired by here. So we do have some questions already, but if you haven't already done so and you'd like to ask Tom a question, feel free to drop it in the question box, and we'll try to include it in the queue for the time that we have left. And we'll absolutely be sharing the links to our collaborative series following the release of the video as well, if you'd like to, again, share them with your colleagues or explore them in a self-paced way. So Tom, I think in keeping with the flow of the presentation, we have questions up top that relate more to the first half of your presentation, more around the tech procurement and sustainable digital design. And then we'll move to questions around the policies that you've been pioneering and experimenting with. So first of all, can you remind us the name of the website you launched for checking a website's carbon footprint? And perhaps can you tell us a bit more about what it does and how it could help a nonprofit get started on this digital transformation journey?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's websitecarbon.com. And yeah, we created this 6 or so years ago, when we first started understanding the carbon footprint of the internet. One of the questions immediately that came up in our team is like, but what does this mean for an individual website or an individual web page? So it's all very well knowing that digital technology represents sort of 2 to 4% of global carbon emissions, but what does it mean for the work I'm doing day to day? How do we make it feel relatable and tangible? So that's the idea of it. It's a very simple, quick tool to try and help people engage with the topic so that you can put your own website in there or your competitor's website, and just get a sense of like, where are we? Are we doing well? Is there room for improvement? And it's a starting point for conversation. From that point forward, you can then obviously then dive deeper into how you might actually make those improvements. But it's a good conversation starter, and a way to help people understand that this thing that feels very intangible and virtual is a real thing that should be talked about.
Thank you. And speaking of digital sustainability, a question we received is around the storing or hosting of images. Does that in itself create carbon emissions, or is it just when people are interacting with media on websites?
It's a great question. I mean, the simple answer is that everything you're doing in digital is having an impact. It's all consuming energy in some way, but the more you do with it, the more that impact scales. So if you've got images sitting on a server, there is some energy being consumed by the fact that there's a data center somewhere that's using some power to store those images. So the more you can strip out your sort of website media libraries and things like that, the better. But most of the impact is going to come when you're actually serving those images to lots and lots of people.
Yeah, thank you. Now I'll try to merge two questions that come in a similar vein and revolve around the limited resources that many nonprofits have to devote to perhaps a tech rehaul or redesign. So in those marketing and communications departments, when there's a need to identify gaps and needs in terms of tech tools, what's the best way to approach this, knowing that maybe the organization is under-resourced or understaffed? And so, how do we move the needle in given these constraints that most nonprofits face today?
Yeah,
like, where would you get started? What would have the most impact?
I think it's important to recognize that like we can't always do everything perfectly, and we have to prioritize within the constraints of the resources we have. I think in terms of websites, there are some low-hanging fruit that they're relatively easy for a lot of nonprofits to get on board with without it costing them a lot of money. So switching to green hosting is one of them, where a lot of hosting companies, like the ones that have a strong environmental policy, generally don't really cost any more in terms of the monthly fees than one that with a poor or non-existent environmental policy. And many of them will do a free migration as well. So actually, that if you can find one that will do a free migration, or if you've got somebody, if you do have somebody, whether it's a freelancer or an agency or somebody in-house who can do the migration, then that's a relatively easy win. The other one really is looking at the content you're publishing and just being mindful about like how many images you're using and whether you've sized them correctly. So are you uploading 4 megabyte images off your camera, or are you like shrinking them down and compressing them? There's some free tools. There's a tool called Squoosh, SQUOOSH. Squoosh, if you Google it, is a really great free tool that you can just pop any image into, So you just upload an image, any size, and you can it'll compress the file, but you can also resize it. So if it's a massive file of your camera and you can say, I only need it to be 1,000 pixels wide, you can just type that in and it will generate you a new compressed image. And you can also preview it, so you can see whether there's going to be any visible loss of quality. Really, really simple. You can compress images in a minute. So that's free. That's an easy win. And then also, if you're using something like WordPress, then there are image compression plugins that are free that you can plug into your website, and will resize images and compress them. So there's some low-hanging fruits. I'll start with the hosting and the images.
Yeah, keep it small and incremental. Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
And now, in terms of your initiatives at Wholegrain around sustainability and wellness and leadership, we're curious to know how are they conceived? How do they come to life? Is it more from being spearheaded by management, or does the team ask you for certain policies? Yeah, who is taking the lead in sort of pioneering new spaces around the sustainability and leadership at your company?
Yeah, good question. It's a bit of a mix. So some of them come from management. Some of them come from other companies or organizations that we've seen doing interesting things, and then we were inspired to kind of try and like adapt our own version of it that works for us. And then there's things that come from the team in terms of questions of like, how could you help us with? So, for example, the spill psychotherapy service. This is our team saying, I mean, that was a COVID thing, really. A team saying, how can you help us with our mental health during this difficult time? And then the leaders led to us researching what those options were and finding spill as a solution that our team has really been grateful for. Similarly, the climate perks one was something that we were actually approached by an environmental nonprofit here in the UK who was trying to encourage companies to do things like this. And then we got them to pitch it to our team and say, is this something that would be useful for you? So they got feedback on the concept, and we got introduced to the idea, and then we ended up implementing it.
That's really interesting, the collaborations that can happen across many levels. And staying on this theme, how would you say the reception has been so far, either internally in your team or even from a client-facing perspective? For example, you mentioned if you do have clients outside of the UK or Europe, then you wouldn't be flying to meet them, but you'd be doing a video call. Have you found any resistance, perhaps from older generations or just from folks in general, say to video calls instead of in-person meetings? Or you can take this question wherever you'd like in terms of reception and resistance.
No, it's a really good question, and I think it's important to say that the challenge of flying is very much contextual to where you are in the world. So, I mean, we're blessed in Western Europe with, I mean, British people complain about the railways here. We're famous for moaning about the railways, but we actually have really good railways compared to most places in the world, and so we can get to a lot of places relatively quickly. And Europe is quite dense, like in terms of its population centers. So the distances are not so great. So it is feasible to travel to a lot of places quite quickly on high-speed rail in Europe. So it's not been a huge problem in that sense. Most of our clients now are fairly comfortable with video calls. It's sort of the world we live in now. So that's fine. I think the places where we've faced difficulties has not been very often, but where we have, it's been two places. One is actually, it's not clients, but it's team members who have an idea that like, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we went to a conference in Berlin? And like you could go, and my answer would be like, yeah, you could go to the conference in Berlin. There's a train to Berlin, but that will take you like 1.5 days. And then they're like, yeah, okay, but I could fly in 2 hours. So there's a bit of resistance there, I think, because there's just the culture of like, just get on a plane and go. Why are we making it difficult? But most of our team generally are pretty cool with that. And some of our team have been to conferences and things around Europe. even quite far afield by train. Somebody went to Athens earlier this year, well, not this year, last summer. So they went all the way to Greece by train and boat, which was an adventure for them. So I think it's about reframing it as an adventure. And then we did have one situation with one of our charity clients a few years ago where they very much respected the no-fly policy, but then a project came up where they wanted us to do some work in Bangladesh, and it was going to be really important to actually like be on the ground to do the user research, and that was then a real dilemma. We kind of that one got solved by the fact that actually the government funding that was going to fund the client to do that project ended up not materializing, so the project didn't happen. But I do think there's always a balance to these things. In that case, we did think, well, actually, if there's a genuine, real social benefit to this, and going and meeting those people on the ground who are going to be the end users of this service offered by this charity, then maybe that's worth doing.
Yeah, I think there are always going to be dilemmas, especially when we're in uncharted territories and just facing
Exactly.
complex issues that only get more complex with time. I did have a question. I was really curious to hear more about if there's any other initiatives you're excited to introduce or expand or implement, but we're running out of time. So perhaps what I'll do is invite all of us to sign up to your newsletters and read your blogs and follow you on social media so we can find the answers in real time as your own journey continues and evolves, and we can continue the conversation and be mutually inspired. So for now, I'll thank you again,